Coastal shipyard, late afternoon. The air is thick with the scent of salt, heavy oil, and the rhythmic clang of metal. Elias, the only mechanic, a single dad with grease-stained sleeves, slowly pulls off his work gloves. A new manager marches in, cold gaze, termination papers in hand. "You're slowing us down, Elias. I don't need you anymore." Elias doesn't argue. He just quietly wipes his hands. The closed sign is hung right at peak hour. 30 minutes later, the ocean surface begins to vibrate violently. Two massive naval helicopters appear, screaming low into the dock. The entire harbor freezes in shock. Elias was a man of quiet competence and heavy silences. At 45, his world was a narrow but deep canal between 2 points: the complex, temperamental engines of the old vessels in the Virginia harbor and his 8-year-old son, Toby. Being a single dad meant Elias lived a life of constant, purposeful motion. He was the first to arrive at the yard and the last to leave, his sleeves always rolled up, revealing skin permanently stained by diesel and history. He was the only person in the region who truly understood the old souls, the massive, temperamental engines of the coastal fleet that required more intuition than software. Elias didn't care for digital spreadsheets or flashy KPI reports. He didn't know how to optimize a slide deck, but he knew exactly how a hairline crack in a manifold sounded at 5,000 RPMs. To him, there was only one way to work, the right way. The trouble started when the shipyard was bought out by a conglomerate. They sent in a new manager, Sarah. She was young, ambitious, and viewed the harbor as a collection of metrics rather than machines. To Sarah, speed was the only currency. She prioritized turnaround times, aesthetic cleanliness, and corporate image over the messy, slow reality of structural safety. Elias remembered the first day Sarah walked into the grease-stained garage. She wore a tailored suit that cost more than his truck and looked at the oil on the floor as if it were a personal insult. "We're going to modernize this facility," she had announced. "Everything will be tracked. Efficiency is our North Star." On multiple occasions, Elias had stood his ground. He refused to release a supply ship because the cooling system felt off. He spent 6 extra hours on a fishing trawler because a vibration in the hull didn't sit right with him. Sarah hated it. To her, every hour Elias spent perfecting a fix was an hour of lost revenue. She saw his expertise as stubbornness, his caution as a bottleneck. "Mr. Ward," she would say, tapping her tablet, "the data says this engine is within normal parameters. Why are you still tearing it down?" "The data doesn't feel the heat in the gasket, Sarah," Elias would respond, his voice low and steady. "The data won't be out there when the storm hits and the power fails." Toby was a fixture at the yard. Every afternoon, the boy would sit on a weathered wooden crate, his school book spread out over his father's heavy metal toolbox. He watched his father work with a sense of quiet pride. Toby saw how the older sailors would wait specifically for Elias, ignoring the younger, faster mechanics. They knew that when Elias touched a machine, it stayed fixed. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday. A high-priority service vessel, owned by one of the conglomerate's biggest clients, was scheduled for departure. Sarah had promised the client it would be ready by 4:00 p.m., but Elias found a faulty seal in the primary drive. It was a minor leak, barely a drip, but it was in a spot that suggested a deeper systemic failure. He demanded a full teardown and resealing. It would take 4 more hours. Sarah exploded. She didn't pull him aside. She didn't whisper. She gathered the entire staff in the center of the hangar, the scent of fresh paint clashing with the old grease. "This yard is a business, not a hobby shop for perfectionists," she shouted, her voice echoing off the corrugated metal. "Elias, your refusal to meet targets is costing us the contract. You are a dinosaur in a digital age. You are slow. You are inefficient. And as of this second, you are fired." She shoved the papers into his chest. It was a public execution designed to humiliate, to show the others that no one was indispensable. The other mechanics, men who had been mentored by Elias for years, looked at their boots. They were afraid for their own mortgages. They remained silent. Elias looked at their faces, seeing the flicker of guilt in their eyes. He knew they were thinking about their own kids, their own bills. He said nothing to make it worse for them. He didn't want their pity. He only wanted the machines to survive. Elias didn't say a word. He didn't beg for his job. He didn't point out that the seal would have failed 10 miles out at sea. He simply walked to his locker, took out his personal set of worn silver wrenches, the ones his own father had given him, and signaled to Toby. "Go to the truck, son," Elias said softly. "We're done here." Sarah personally walked to the main gate and slammed it shut. She hung a heavy brass "closed" sign, signaling the end of the shift for everyone, a power move to show she controlled the very rhythm of the harbor. The yard, usually a symphony of pneumatic drills and rhythmic hammering, fell into a hollow, unnatural silence. Elias stood outside the fence for a moment, looking at the water. He didn't feel anger. He felt a strange, heavy sense of foreboding. He knew the machines better than anyone. He knew they didn't care about KPIs. He leaned against his truck, waiting as the coastal wind began to pick up, carrying the scent of a coming storm. The silence was a warning only he could hear. The wind off the Atlantic began to shift, turning from a warm breeze to a sharp, leaden howl. The sky bruised into a deep purple, the kind of color that warned sailors to seek harbor immediately. Out on the horizon, the waves began to peak with white foam, changing color from a friendly blue to a dangerous, churning slate. Inside the shipyard office, Sarah was trying to celebrate her decisiveness. She poured herself a coffee and started drafting a report for the headquarters on how she had finally removed the primary bottleneck in the facility. She felt powerful. She felt modern. She looked at her reflection in the glass, seeing a leader, unaware that she was looking at a ghost of an industry she didn't understand. But the atmosphere in the harbor had turned electric with tension. The radio in the break room, usually filled with classic rock, was now tuned to the emergency frequencies. Rumors began to ripple through the radio waves about an emergency operation unfolding 20 miles offshore. A high-stakes transport, carrying vital cargo, had suffered a critical mechanical failure in the middle of the rising swells. Sarah tried to brush it off. "It's a military matter," she told her nervous leads who had gathered at her window. "The Navy has their own technicians. They have state-of-the-art diagnostic tools. It has nothing to do with us. We have our own metrics to meet." Elias sat in the cab of his old truck, the heater humming. Toby was sitting quietly beside him, drawing engines in his notebook. Elias's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the screen. It wasn't a local number. It was an encrypted military line, a line he hadn't seen active in nearly 10 years. He answered. He didn't speak. He just listened. The voice on the other end was frantic but controlled. Elias's eyes narrowed as he looked at the locked gates of the shipyard. He looked at the heavy brass sign he had polished just a week ago. "Is everything okay, Dad?" Toby asked, noticing his father's grip tightening on the steering wheel. Elias put the phone down. "Wait for me just a bit longer, son. The sea is calling in a debt, and it doesn't accept excuses. Some people learn the hard way that you can't fire a legend." Suddenly, the roar of twin turbines shattered the coastal quiet. It wasn't the distant hum of a commercial flight. This was the bone-shaking, window-rattling thunder of military power. Two massive MH-60 Seahawk naval helicopters broke through the low cloud layer, their rotors whipping the harbor water into a white frenzy. They didn't head for the military airbase 5 miles north. They flared their noses, the pilots displaying incredible skill as they executed an emergency combat landing directly onto the open gravel lot adjacent to the locked shipyard. The downdraft was immense, knocking over heavy trash cans and sending Sarah's promotional banners flying into the dirt like discarded rags. A naval commander, his face hard as flint and eyes weary from hours of command, leaped from the lead bird before the wheels had even settled on the gravel. He didn't look for the manager. He didn't look for a reception desk. He looked for the man he had served with in the Gulf. Elias Ward!" the commander bellowed, his voice cutting through the dying whine of the turbines. The harbor crowd gathered, stunned. Sarah rushed out of the office, her hair a mess from the wind, shielding her eyes from the dust. She tried to maintain her professional veneer, smoothing her blazer. "Commander, I am Sarah Jenkins, the manager of this facility. How can we assist the United States Navy? We have our most efficient team standing by. We operate with world-class precision. The commander didn't even acknowledge her existence. He didn't even look at her. He marched straight toward the truck where Elias was standing. The crowd of mechanics and dock workers parted like the Red Sea, a path forming instinctively for the officer. "Elias," the commander said, his voice dropping into a tense, urgent tone as he reached the truck. "We have a catastrophic rotor synchronization failure on our third bird offshore. It's carrying a heart for a transplant at the VA hospital and a high-level diplomatic team. My boys can't isolate the vibration. The digital diagnostics say the system is perfect, but the pilot says the stick is shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. We were told you're the only man on the eastern seaboard who understands the harmonics of these modified Mark 12 turbines." Sarah stepped forward, her voice cracking with a mix of fear and desperation. "Sir, there must be some mistake. Mr. Ward, he was fired 30 minutes ago. He's no longer an authorized representative of the shipyard. He's outdated. We have a certified team inside with the latest software. They are the future of this yard." The commander turned his head slowly. It was the movement of a predator. His eyes were like cold steel, reflecting the gray sky. "I don't give a damn about your internal politics or your authorized representatives, lady. I have a crew 10 minutes away from a watery grave and a mission that cannot fail. I don't need a certified team with software that can't find a heartbeat. I need the best mechanic in the fleet, and that is Elias Ward. Right now. Get out of the way before the Navy moves you." The weight of Sarah's decision suddenly felt like a mountain of lead crushing her chest. The silence of the harbor was gone, replaced by the thrumming, vibrating urgency of the military. Every eye, from the janitor to the wealthiest boat owner, was on Elias. The man she had called slow and inefficient was now the only bridge between life and death for people miles out at sea. Elias looked at the helicopters, their gray paint stained by salt spray. He looked at Toby, who was watching him with wide eyes. Then he looked at the locked gates of the shipyard, the closed sign dangling mockingly in the wind. "The gate is locked, Commander," Elias said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "And my tools are on the other side. Sarah said I wasn't efficient enough to be in there. She wanted speed, but she forgot about the soul of the machine." Elias didn't wait for Sarah's permission. He didn't even look at her. He stepped toward the helicopter, his eyes already scanning the airframe with a hunter's focus. "Tell me the frequency of the shutter," Elias said to the lead pilot, who had followed the commander out. "It's a high-pitch oscillation, sir. Starts at 85% torque. We thought it was the gearbox, but the sensors say it's within thermal limits. It feels like the whole tail is going to shake itself off. It's unlike anything we've seen in the manuals." Twist 1. The hidden past. The commander turned to Sarah, who was standing paralyzed in the wind, her tablet clutched to her chest like a shield. "You fired a Master Chief Petty Officer who spent 15 years as the lead propulsion instructor for the Naval Air Systems Command? You fired the man who personally designed the secondary cooling bypass for this specific airframe after the 2014 crashes?" The color drained from Sarah's face until she was as gray as the helicopters. She had never looked past the mechanic label on his file. She had never seen the commendations buried in his history because she was too busy looking at his turnaround times. She had only seen a man who worked too slow. She had fired the very architect of the machine she was trying to manage. Elias looked at the gate. "I need the shop open. I need the ultrasonic diagnostic rig, the one I had to beg you to buy, and my custom torque set, the ones you said were an unnecessary expense." Sarah hesitated, her corporate instincts still fighting for air, even in the face of a military emergency. "But the liability insurance, the internal protocols for unauthorized access, I haven't processed the temporary reinstatement paperwork. We need a digital signature." The commander didn't argue. He didn't use words. He signaled to two of his crewmen, heavily armed and looking quite serious. "Under the Emergency Defense Act, I am taking control of this facility. Open the gate, or we will remove it with the winch of that Seahawk and bill your headquarters for the damage. Decide now." The gate was unlocked in 5 seconds. Sarah practically fell over herself to get the keys out. Elias moved into the workshop with a speed and precision that left the other mechanics breathless. It wasn't the frantic, panicked speed Sarah usually demanded, the kind that led to dropped bolts and missed steps. It was the silent speed. Every movement had a purpose. Every tool was grabbed without looking. He bypassed the standard diagnostic computer entirely, pushing it aside as if it were a toy. The other mechanics gathered at the windows, watching their old mentor in awe. They saw a man transformed, a warrior returning to his arena. "The sensors are lying to you," Elias muttered as he climbed onto the service platform, Toby following at a safe distance, holding his father's flashlight. "The Mark 12 has a blind spot in the vibration dampener near the intake. The software filters out the high-frequency noise because it thinks it's background interference. If you trust the software, you die. Computers don't have ears. They only have logic." Twist 2, the KPI trap. Elias pointed to a tiny, almost invisible hairline fracture near the primary fuel rail. It was so small it looked like a stray hair. This is what happens when you optimize a service cycle to save an hour. You missed a microscopic stress fracture because you were rushing the visual inspection. You were so worried about the ship leaving at 4:01 p.m. that you didn't look at the metal fatigue. You saw a deadline. I saw a death trap. He looked at Sarah, who was watching from the doorway, her suit now stained by the blowing dust. If you had pushed this to 90% torque during the storm, this rail would have shattered. The fire would have reached the cockpit in 4 seconds. Your efficiency would have killed 6 men and a heart that was supposed to save a life today. How does that look on your spreadsheet? Sarah stood in the shadows of the hangar, watching her entire KPI philosophy be torn apart by a man with a wrench. The efficiency she had demanded was actually a death warrant. Elias didn't waste a single word after that. For 45 minutes, the only sounds were the sharp clink of wrenches and the low, intense commands Elias gave to the naval technicians. He was no longer a janitor of engines. He was a conductor of a mechanical orchestra. He worked with a calm intensity that silenced the room. The air was thick with the smell of JP-8 fuel and the raw power of a man who knew exactly who he was. He executed a complex bypass of the dampener, reinforcing the fuel rail with a precision that the factory specs didn't even cover. He used techniques he had developed in the field, under fire, where there were no manuals. "Clear the deck," Elias ordered, stepping down and wiping his hands on a rag. "Fire her up." The turbine screamed to life, a high-pitched whine that settled into a powerful roar. The pilot watched the gauges. 80% torque, 85, 90. The helicopter sat as steady as a rock on the gravel, the glass in the cockpit not even rattling. The vibration was gone. The sound was a perfect, rhythmic purr. The commander grasped Elias's hand, a firm warrior-to-warrior grip. "Chief, you're a lifesaver, not just for my crew, but for the mission. We'll be at the hospital in 10 minutes. You haven't lost your touch." Elias nodded once, his face reflecting the orange glow of the hangar lights. "Do the job right or don't do it at all, Commander. The sea doesn't care about your schedule. It only cares about the truth." The 2 Seahawks lifted off, their downdraft blowing Sarah's termination papers, which she had dropped in the mud, into the churning dark water of the harbor. As they disappeared into the storm, the shipyard fell back into silence. But this time, it was a silence of profound respect. Elias stood in the middle of the hangar, his hands finally clean. He looked at the other mechanics. They didn't say a word. They just stood up, one by one, and began to walk back to their stations, their heads held a little higher, knowing they had just seen what true mastery looked like. They knew the world had changed. The news of the naval intervention reached the corporate headquarters by the next morning. It wasn't just a local story. The story of the fired expert who saved the Navy went viral on social media, fueled by cell phone footage from the dock workers. The owner of the shipyard personally arrived by private jet before noon. He was a man who had built his fortune on quality, and he was livid. Sarah was gone before the sun set. Her efficiency-first approach was deemed a catastrophic liability, and the conglomerate didn't want the PR nightmare of being the company that almost killed a heart transplant team for a bonus. She left with her tablet and her suit, but she left behind her dignity. The following Monday morning, a meeting was held on the shop floor. The owner stood where Sarah had once stood, but he didn't shout. He didn't have a tablet. He looked at Elias, who was already back at work on a damaged trawler. The yard felt different. The air was clearer, the pace more deliberate. "We made a grave error," the owner said to the assembled staff. "We mistook expertise for slowness. We mistook caution for a bottleneck. We forgot that in this business, the only metric that matters is the safety of the men and women on the water. We prioritized the clock over the craftsman." Elias was offered his job back, but with a new title, Chief of Quality and Technical Operations. He was given absolute authority over every engine that left the gate. He was given a budget that prioritized tools over office furniture. "I have one condition," Elias told the owner, his voice calm but unyielding as he sat in the main office for the first time. "We never cut corners. We never rush a safety check to meet a deadline. If a job takes 10 hours to be safe, it takes 10 hours. My son needs to know that his father builds things that don't break, and this shipyard needs to remember that we are the last line of defense for those at sea. If you want speed, find someone else. If you want safety, you listen to me." The owner agreed immediately. The KPI metrics were thrown out and replaced by a single standard, the Elias standard. The atmosphere in the shipyard shifted. The mechanics no longer looked at the clock with fear. They looked at the machines with focus. They began to take pride in the grease under their fingernails, seeing it as a badge of honor rather than a sign of inefficiency. They started staying late not because they were told to, but because they wanted to make sure the weld was perfect. They became a tribe of craftsmen again. The most beautiful moment came a week later. A calm, golden morning where the water looked like glass. Elias and Toby were sitting on a bench at the edge of the dock, sharing a quiet breakfast of coffee and donuts, watching the sun dance on the gentle waves. "Dad," Toby asked, looking at the distant Navy base where the helicopters were stationed, "why weren't you mad when that lady fired you?" "I was really mad for you. I thought we were going to lose everything." Elias looked at his hands, the scars of 30 years of honest work, the permanent oil in the creases of his palms. "Because, Toby, being right isn't about winning an argument or keeping a job. It's about making sure that when people trust you with their lives, you're worthy of that trust. Doing it right is the only victory that matters. Everything else is just noise. People like that manager. They come and go, but the truth stays in the steel." The culture of the shipyard was rebuilt from the ground up. Speed was no longer the goal. Integrity was. And for the first time in years, the closed sign stayed off during the day, and the gates stayed open for those who truly understood the value of an expert. The harbor became a destination for the most difficult jobs, with owners traveling hundreds of miles just to have Elias take a look. Elias returned to his work with the same quiet humility, but his presence now commanded the room without a single shout. He didn't need a suit or a tablet to lead. He became a living legend in the coastal community, the man who spoke through the engines he fixed. Every engine that left his shop bore his invisible mark of excellence. A new manager was hired, but this time, it was a veteran engineer who had spent 20 years at sea. He spent his first day on the floor with Elias, getting his own hands dirty, listening more than he talked. They built a system where safety was the primary KPI, and strangely enough, the shipyard became the most profitable it had ever been. Not because it was fast, but because it was trusted. People were willing to pay a premium for the Elias standard. Sarah's career in the maritime industry was over. She became a cautionary tale in business schools, a lesson in how the efficiency trap can lead to total failure. She had tried to measure the wind with a ruler and failed to see the storm coming. She forgot that you can't manage what you don't respect. Toby grew up in that workshop, surrounded by the smell of diesel and the sound of integrity. He didn't just learn how to fix engines. He learned how to be a man of character. He saw that true strength doesn't come from a loud voice or a title on a door, but from the quiet mastery of one's craft and the courage to say no when everyone else is saying faster. He became the second generation of the Elias standard. The two naval helicopters became a symbol for the harbor. Every time a Seahawk flew overhead, the mechanics would look up from their work and remember the day the expert was fired and the day he saved the mission. It served as a reminder that the quietest man in the room is often the one carrying the most weight. The final message was etched into the mind of every worker and eventually onto a small plaque near the entrance. Life cannot be quantified by a spreadsheet. The silence after the rotor's departure on that stormy night was the most powerful lesson of all. It was the sound of truth returning to the harbor. It was the sound of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. Elias stepped back into his workshop, picked up his favorite silver wrench, and began to work on a new engine. The ocean was calm. The world was steady. Toby sat on his crate reading his book, safe in the knowledge that his father's work would always hold true. A single father had stood his ground, and in doing so, he had reminded everyone that some things are worth the time they take, and some men are worth more than any number on a page. The silence of the expert had finally spoken, and the world was better for it. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to NL Touching Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.